Okay, we've reached the third in our series, our short series of 3 videos looking at the UK supply side. Now, when you're writing about supply side policies, please try to avoid generic answers. It's easy to write the government could spend more on education and training. It's not wrong to say that in an exam, but actually I think it's much better if you're more specific and more granular in the detail you offer, because if that's the case, this opens doors to much stronger evaluation of the effectiveness of supply side policies over time. And hopefully this next few minutes will give you some good examples for your revision notes of very specific intervention supply side approaches of recent times in the UK. Again, I'll leave this slide up as I talk you through it. Please take a screenshot if you want to add it to your notes. But here's a whole range of specific examples of UK supply side policies, some of which are market-based, others are interventionist in terms of their approach. Privatisation, well, that's kind of tailed off a little bit in recent times. The last big privatisation was probably the Royal Mail, part privatised in 2013 and fully sold off in 2016. It's now a listed company on the stock market. Channel 4 has been proposed for privatisation by the Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, in recent weeks. Channel 4 is state-owned and gets its funding from advertising. It's profitable, it's highly successful. And in my opinion, there's no obvious reason why it should be privatised, but it has been proposed. A really key one, which is in the news at the moment, is the impact of the deregulation of the UK retail energy market. So a few years ago, the government essentially opened up the market, the retail market, providing energy, electricity and gas to households and businesses, rather than the generation of electricity, but just the retail aspect to lots of new small businesses like Bulb Energy and Octopus and others. Now, many firms came in and many firms have left. As you'll know, there's been a hemorrhaging of smaller firms because of the increase in the world and then the wholesale price of gas. So deregulation was a very free market approach, which has been criticised by many people. The UK government has introduced 8 new free ports. These are sort of places, often airports and shipping areas, where you're given quite specific tax incentives for exporting and importing. They've established new regional enterprise zones in areas of below average economic activity. Quite interesting, worth reading up on those. One of the key interventions in the labour market has been to offer tax-free childcare. So I think the figure is £500 every 3 months, up to £2,000 a year for each child. And again, you can see why that's an important intervention designed to get more working mothers back into the labour force. Of course, one of the issues there is the availability and the quality of childcare. Can the industry keep up with demand? Recently, the government's created 20 new institutes of technology across the UK. They've rolled out the new T levels, equivalent to A levels. Creation of the National Skills Fund, not easy to say, and the Kickstart scheme for long-term unemployed, the apprenticeship levy. So a whole series of interventions that you might well want to just know about in the labour market. And of course, you can Google all of these things. You can find out more if you want some specific detail. The minimum wage is often seen by many people as a supply-side policy. Look, free market economists don't favour a minimum wage, but interventionists say that actually, yes, increasing the minimum wage can stimulate labour supply, labour activity. And it went up by 6.6% in April 2022 to £9.51 per hour. The UK, of course, has left the EU. It's now introduced its own immigration system, moving towards a points-based system based on skills and languages and jobs and things. One interesting intervention, which I've highlighted in green there, is the super deduction tax incentive for business capital investments. So small businesses in particular can now offset against their corporation tax 125% of the money they spend on investments, upgrading their computer systems, buying some new tools, plant and machinery, etc. And they can write that off actually very quickly against tax. And that's been quite successful in trying to lift small-scale investment by small businesses. Then big things, such as major infrastructure projects. So you'll have some examples in your notes. The Lower Thames Crossing, the multi-billion-pound London super sewer. Nationally, of course, some funding for rolling out what's needed in terms of electrical vehicle charging infrastructure, the UK Gigabyte programme and the shared rural network. And linked with that, things like with the relaxation of planning for new social housing, for renewable energy, and the establishment of the UK emissions trading scheme to replace the EU scheme when we were part of the European Union. So there's a whole series of detail here, but hopefully you get the picture, the wider picture, that supply side policies is an area of the syllabus where if you have that little extra detail, you can make your exam answer really, really good. There are some sectors, of course, that are really driving aggregate supply. One thinks of life sciences, things like the pharmaceutical sector that contributes nearly £40 billion to the economy, 500,000 jobs. Renewable energy, of course, is a fast-growing sector. Wind energy accounted for 25% of the total electricity generation in the UK in 2020. So there are two sectors that really are growing very quickly. Likewise, material science, 100 billion turnover in the UK now, very big contribution to exports and jobs. One thinks about things like graphene as a really good example of that. And our creative industries. The UK has one of the biggest export sectors of creative industries in the world, 115 billion pounds of GDP, nearly 6% of our output. Things like architecture and marketing and branding and design, film, television and digital media. We have a very, very strong creative industry sector. The UK government, of course, is trying to encourage more foreign investment to drive capacity and supply and competitiveness. There's a proposal to try and convert some of the old office blocks in Canary Wharf into a life science cluster. The UK government trying to set up get Moderna, one of the major American pharmaceutical startups, to come to the UK as well. So there's a lot going on the supply side. It really is a lot to add into your notes. A little bit, the final slide, just thinking about evaluation. So supply side policies, of course, the obvious evaluation points are that they can, there's long time lags and there's an opportunity cost. Well, I want to go beyond that in a sense. First of all, when we think about lower taxes, lower taxes in theory should stimulate both labour supply and investment. But they don't necessarily do that. People don't necessarily work longer hours if the income tax rate goes down. Companies don't necessarily invest more if the corporation tax rate goes down. And of course, these lower taxes could contribute to high levels of income and wealth inequality. Deregulation is a favoured supply-side policy amongst many, and it can have positive effects in driving competition and innovation, but it can also lead to increasing instability. So the light touch regulation of financial markets before the global financial crisis of 2007 is a widely cited criticism. And the collapse of many small energy companies in the UK in the last couple of years is again a criticism of deregulation of the energy market. The labour market, flexibility. There are many advantages, both for employers and employees, from having flexible contracts and flexible pay and things. And unemployment is low. But it also risks causing income insecurity. We talk about the precariat, people in vulnerable, insecure jobs. It's also perhaps contributed to higher working poverty. And some businesses in a very flexible labour market may not invest as much in training and workplace skills. We call that the free rider problem, where you train somebody up for 2 years and then in a flexible labour market they leave. There's also risks from government failure, so not every intervention is effective. A good example is the apprenticeship levy introduced in 2017. Businesses with a payroll of more than £3 million had to put 0.5% into an apprenticeship fund. But actually the complexity, the bureaucracy attached to the scheme hasn't really worked. The number of apprenticeships taken up by 19-year-olds has dropped quite a lot, actually, counter to what the government wanted to do. So maybe there's a case there for the government to fully fund apprenticeships rather than get the private sector to do it. And finally, policies do not operate in isolation. So yes, the UK has left the European Union Customs Union, we've left the European Union Single Market, and we seem to be going around the world signing up free trade deals with many countries, including Japan and New Zealand and other places. So in that sense, trade is being liberalised, but a lot of businesses in the UK now finding the cost of trading with the EU, the non-tariff barriers, the complexities and costs of trade have gone up. And of course, we do over 40% of our trade with the EU. Please avoid, and this is a really strong point I'd like to emphasize, please avoid the generic arguments that supply side policies always have long time lags or big opportunity costs. They don't necessarily have that. Policy can often have an impact quite quickly, and so a lot of supply side policies aren't necessarily very costly. And there's these are exam points that students throw in without really thinking about the specific nature of each intervention. And finally, whenever you get the word effectiveness in a question, so assess the effectiveness of, infrastructure investments to the UK economy, assess the effectiveness of a minimum wage as a way of addressing relative poverty, assess the impact of cutting income tax on the labour supply. Whenever that word effectiveness appears in an exam question, to get the highest marks of evaluation, you really must try to introduce somewhere in the answer alternative policies and interventions. So, for example, to try and encourage more people into work, is it income tax that's most effective, or is it tax-free childcare or a higher minimum wage? To reduce immobility of labour, is it rent controls or increasing the supply of social housing? Whenever you start talking about alternatives, that lifts your evaluation on the supply side to another level. Well, there we go. Hopefully you found these 3 videos useful covering supply side economics.